My girlfriend said I was creating unnecessary drama when I confronted her about another man's hand on her thigh. That moment at an upscale wine bar in downtown Phoenix changed everything between us, though I realize now the relationship had been deteriorating for months while I convinced myself things would improve. I had arrived straight from my aerospace engineering job, still wearing my button-down and khakis, walking into what I thought was a casual work celebration for Melody's marketing consulting firm. The venue was one of those trendy rooftop places with overpriced cocktails and a view of the desert skyline, exactly the kind of spot that Melody had started frequenting since joining her new company. Instead of finding a relaxed team dinner, I found myself witnessing the end of our 4-year relationship in real time. Melody had been different lately, more focused on external validation from her new colleagues than on building anything meaningful with me. She'd started working at this boutique marketing firm 6 months ago, and everything about her personality seemed to shift with each passing week. The woman who once appreciated quiet evenings reading together and thoughtful conversations about our future had become someone who thrived on attention from male coworkers and seemed constantly dissatisfied with our stable life together. I'd been rationalizing away months of boundary violations and gaslighting, telling myself that her new job stress was temporary and that she'd return to being the person I fell in love with during graduate school. She'd started staying out later, becoming secretive about her phone, and developing this need for constant social media validation that felt completely foreign to the woman I'd known. But watching Brett, her team leader, casually claim ownership of her body while she smiled and leaned into his touch made everything crystal clear. His hand wasn't just resting on her leg, it was positioned high on her thigh in a way that communicated possession, and she was not only allowing it but encouraging the contact by pressing closer to him during their conversation. When I approached their table and asked if we could talk privately, Melody looked annoyed rather than embarrassed. She told me I was being possessive and making a scene over nothing, that Brett was just being friendly because he'd had a few drinks and everyone was celebrating their successful campaign launch. The way she defended him while dismissing my legitimate concerns revealed everything I needed to know about where her loyalties actually lay. I wasn't her boyfriend in that moment. I was an inconvenience interrupting her real relationship. The months of expensive dinners, designer clothes, student loan payments, and rent for our luxury downtown loft suddenly felt like investments in someone else's life rather than our shared future. I realized I'd been funding her transformation into a person who had no respect for me or our relationship boundaries. Instead of creating the angry confrontation everyone at the table seemed to expect, I felt this strange calm wash over me. I finished my whiskey, pulled out my wallet, and paid for the entire table's drinks without saying another word. The gesture cost me nearly $300, and the tip alone was probably more than Brett made in a day, but money wasn't the point anymore. I walked out of that wine bar knowing that whatever we'd built together was already over, and that Melody had chosen her path long before I'd arrived to witness it. She called my name as I reached the exit, her voice carrying that manipulative tone she used when she wanted me to chase after her and beg for forgiveness. I could hear the slight panic creeping in as she realized I wasn't playing along with her usual script. But I didn't turn around. For the first time in months, my head was completely clear about what needed to happen next. The drive home through Phoenix's evening traffic gave me time to process what I'd witnessed, and I found myself thinking about all the small moments that had led to this larger betrayal. How she'd started mentioning Brett's name more frequently in our conversations, always with this subtle admiration that should have concerned me. How she'd begun dressing differently for work, choosing outfits that emphasized her figure rather than her professionalism. How she'd started coming home later and later, claiming team meetings and networking events that somehow never included spouses or partners. I'd rationalized every single warning sign because I wanted to believe in the relationship we'd built together, but tonight had stripped away all my illusions about who Melody had become and what she actually valued. The woman sitting at that table wasn't the person I'd fallen in love with in graduate school, and I was done pretending otherwise. Looking back, I can see how our relationship foundation had been slowly eroding long before Brett entered the picture. Melody and I met during our final year of graduate school at Arizona State University, when I was finishing my aerospace engineering degree and she was completing her MBA with a focus on marketing strategy. Back then, she was driven and ambitious in ways that genuinely impressed me, She had clear goals about building a career in brand management and talked passionately about creating campaigns that actually connected with consumers rather than just pushing products. I was 27 then, she was 25, and we seemed to complement each other perfectly. My analytical nature balanced her creative energy, and her social confidence helped draw me out of the engineering mindset that sometimes made me too focused on technical problems and not enough on human connections. We moved in together after graduation, and I was happy to carry most of the financial load while she established herself professionally. My starting salary as an aerospace engineer at Honeywell was solid enough to cover our downtown Phoenix loft, her student loan payments, and the lifestyle she wanted to maintain. I genuinely didn't mind supporting her career development because I believed we were building something together, working toward shared goals that would benefit both of us in the long term. For the first 3 years, that's exactly what it felt like. Melody worked at a traditional marketing firm where she learned campaign development and client management, putting in long hours and gradually building her professional reputation. She was grateful for my financial support and made sure I knew she appreciated the stability it gave her to focus on advancing her career without the stress of financial pressure. But everything changed when she left that structured environment for her current position at this boutique consulting firm that prioritized networking events and client entertainment over actual strategic work. The new job brought a completely different crowd into our lives, account executives and consultants who treated work like an extended social hour, spending more time planning happy hours than developing marketing strategies. Melody started adopting their priorities, becoming increasingly focused on image management and social media presence rather than professional development. She began spending money we didn't have on designer clothes and expensive dinners, justifying every purchase as necessary for maintaining her professional image. Her personality shifted to match her new colleagues' party-focused lifestyle, and suddenly our quiet evenings together felt boring to her compared to the constant stimulation of bars and networking events. The most concerning change was her growing need for male validation from her coworkers, particularly from Brett, who had positioned himself as the unofficial leader of their social group. I'd started noticing expensive items appearing in her closet, designer shoes, luxury handbags, jewelry that definitely exceeded our budget, but when I asked about them, she'd claim they were necessary investments in her professional appearance or gifts from grateful clients. Her phone behavior became increasingly secretive, and she'd smile at messages in ways that made my stomach turn, though she always claimed it was just work-related humor that I wouldn't understand. The late nights became more frequent, always with explanations about client dinners or team-building exercises that somehow never included any mention of other people's partners being invited. I convinced myself I was being paranoid rather than protective, that my engineering mindset was making me overanalyze normal workplace dynamics and social relationships. But deep down, I knew something fundamental had shifted in how Melody saw me and our relationship. She'd started treating our home like a place to sleep and change clothes rather than the foundation we'd built together. She'd lost interest in our future plans and seemed restless whenever we spent quiet time together, always checking her phone or making excuses to go out with her work friends. The woman who once appreciated thoughtful gestures and meaningful conversations had become someone who measured everything by its social media potential and networking value. I should have confronted the changes earlier, but I kept hoping she'd realize what she was sacrificing and choose to prioritize our relationship over her new lifestyle. Instead, she seemed to drift further away each week, and by the time Brett appeared as the focal point of her attention, I was already losing her to a version of herself that valued excitement and validation over stability and genuine connection. Tonight had simply forced me to accept what I'd been avoiding for months, that the woman I'd fallen in love with no longer existed, and the person she'd become had no real use for the life we'd built together. The evening had started with Melody insisting that I absolutely had to attend this celebration at Skyline Wine Bar, one of Phoenix's most exclusive rooftop venues with panoramic views of the desert mountains and price points that reflected its premium location. She'd been building up this event for weeks, claiming that her colleagues thought I was too serious and analytical, that they needed to see my fun side to understand why someone like her would be with an aerospace engineer. The way she framed it made me feel like I was some kind of project she needed to showcase rather than her boyfriend of 4 years, but I agreed because I wanted to support her career and meet the people who had become such a central part of her life. She spent 2 hours getting ready, choosing the black designer dress I'd bought her for our 3rd anniversary, styling her blonde hair in loose waves, and applying makeup with the precision of someone preparing for a photo shoot rather than a casual work gathering. Everything about her preparation suggested this was far more important to her than any event we'd attended together in recent memory. When we arrived at the wine bar, I immediately understood why Melody had been so focused on her appearance and so insistent that I make a good impression. The venue screamed expensive sophistication, with its glass walls overlooking the twinkling lights of downtown Phoenix and servers who moved with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to wealthy clientele. The group had claimed a prime spot on the outdoor terrace, arranged around a large circular seating area that naturally created an inner circle for the core team and outer positions for anyone less important. Brett had positioned himself at the center like some kind of unofficial king holding court, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent and a watch that caught the light every time he gestured. He was exactly the kind of guy who commanded attention through confidence and charisma rather than substance, speaking with the smooth authority of someone who'd never been challenged or questioned by the people around him. The power dynamics became immediately clear as introductions were made. Brett barely acknowledged me with a dismissive handshake and immediately turned his attention back to Melody, who transformed into a completely different person in his presence. The confident, independent woman I'd known became giggly and deferential, hanging on his every word and laughing at jokes that weren't particularly funny. The other team members followed Brett's lead in treating me like an outsider who didn't quite belong, making inside references and discussing projects in ways that deliberately excluded me from their conversations. I found myself physically separated from the group by the seating arrangement, forced to stand awkwardly behind Melody's chair while Brett dominated the circular setup from his prime position directly across from her. The exclusion felt calculated rather than accidental, designed to reinforce the hierarchy while making me feel like an unwelcome intruder at their private party. I watched Melody adopt mannerisms and expressions I'd never seen before, tilting her head when Brett spoke and touching his arm during conversation in ways that communicated intimate familiarity. She wore the dress I'd chosen for our anniversary dinner, but she'd styled it specifically for Brett's attention, and I could see him appreciating every detail of her appearance with the confidence of someone who considered her his territory. The conversation flowed around topics that deliberately showcased Brett's success and leadership while minimizing my aerospace engineering career as something boring and technical that couldn't compare to their dynamic marketing world. I noticed coordinated outfit choices among the team members, inside jokes that suggested frequent socializing outside work hours, and a level of personal intimacy that went far beyond professional relationships. When Brett ordered another round of expensive wine for the table, he made sure everyone knew he was covering the cost, establishing his role as provider and leader while making my presence feel even more superfluous. Melody's complete transformation in his presence was the most disturbing part of the evening, watching her become someone who sought approval and validation rather than offering her own opinions or insights. She'd become an audience for Brett's performance rather than an equal participant in the conversation, and she seemed perfectly content with that diminished role as long as it kept his attention focused on her. The entire dynamic made me realize that I was witnessing a completely orchestrated social hierarchy where Brett held court and everyone else competed for his approval and attention. Melody had bought completely into this system, positioning herself as his primary supporter and most devoted follower rather than maintaining any sense of independent identity or professional dignity. The wine flowed freely, expensive bottles that Brett selected with theatrical flair while discussing their complex flavor profiles as if his knowledge somehow validated his superiority over everyone else at the table. I found myself analyzing the group dynamics with the same systematic approach I used for engineering problems, and what I observed was a carefully constructed power structure designed to feed Brett's ego while keeping everyone else in subordinate positions. The most telling moments came when other team members tried to contribute ideas or experiences, only to be subtly dismissed or redirected back to topics that allowed Brett to dominate the conversation. Melody participated enthusiastically in this dynamic, even shutting down her own colleagues when they threatened to steal attention from Brett's stories about his client connections and lifestyle choices. I excused myself to use the restroom around 10:30, needing a few minutes away from the suffocating atmosphere of forced enthusiasm and Brett's constant performance. The bathroom gave me a chance to collect my thoughts and process what I was witnessing, though part of me was already dreading returning to that table and continuing to watch Melody's transformation into someone I barely recognized. When I walked back onto the terrace, I stopped mid-step at what I saw waiting for me. Brett had repositioned himself directly next to Melody while I was gone, and his hand was resting high on her thigh in a way that communicated pure ownership. This wasn't some accidental contact or casual friendly gesture. His fingers were positioned possessively on her leg, and she was leaning into his touch rather than pulling away or creating distance. The intimate nature of their body language made it clear that this level of physical contact was familiar and welcomed between them, not some spontaneous moment of drunken boundary crossing. Everyone else at the table could see exactly what was happening, but they continued their conversations as if watching their team leader claim another man's girlfriend was perfectly normal workplace behavior. I approached the table calmly and made direct eye contact with Brett, who didn't bother removing his hand or even looking embarrassed about being caught in such an obviously inappropriate position. Instead, he smiled at me with the kind of smug confidence that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing and didn't care about my presence or opinion in the slightest. I asked Melody if we could speak privately for a moment, keeping my voice level and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Her response revealed everything I needed to know about where her loyalties actually lay and how little respect she had for me or our relationship. She looked annoyed rather than embarrassed, irritated that I was interrupting her moment with Brett rather than ashamed that she'd been caught allowing another man to touch her intimately in public. She told me I was being possessive and creating unnecessary drama over nothing, that Brett was just being friendly because he'd had a few drinks and everyone was celebrating their successful campaign completion. The way she defended his behavior while dismissing my legitimate concerns made it crystal clear that she'd already chosen sides in this situation, and it wasn't mine. She actually had the nerve to suggest that I was embarrassing myself by making a scene, as if my reaction to witnessing her physical intimacy with another man was somehow unreasonable or controlling. The public nature of her humiliation felt calculated and deliberate, designed to establish Brett's dominance while reducing me to the role of jealous, irrational boyfriend who couldn't handle normal workplace relationships. I wasn't her partner in that moment. I was an obstacle to her real relationship, an inconvenience interrupting the dynamic she'd chosen to prioritize over everything we'd built together. The months of expensive dinners, designer clothes, student loan payments, and rent for our luxury downtown loft suddenly felt like investments in someone else's future rather than our shared life. I realized I'd been funding her transformation into a person who saw me as a financial safety net rather than a romantic partner, someone who provided stability while she explored more exciting options with men like Brett. Instead of creating the angry confrontation everyone at the table seemed to expect, I felt this strange surgical clarity wash over me. The emotional investment I'd maintained in our relationship simply evaporated, replaced by the kind of analytical detachment I used when evaluating failed engineering projects that needed to be terminated to prevent further resource waste. I could see the situation with perfect objectivity now. Melody had already made her choice weeks or months ago, and tonight was simply the moment she decided to make it public and official. The realization didn't devastate me the way I would have expected. Instead, it freed me from the exhausting effort of trying to save something that was already dead. I finished my whiskey in one smooth motion, pulled out my wallet, and methodically paid for the entire table's drinks without saying another word to anyone. The gesture cost me nearly $300 including tip, but it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about maintaining my dignity while demonstrating that I could afford to be generous even while being discarded. I made sure Brett could see exactly how much I was spending, establishing that whatever game he thought he was winning was being played with my resources rather than his own. Then I simply walked toward the exit with the calm confidence of someone who just made the most important decision of his life. The 20-minute drive back to our downtown loft gave me enough time to shift into complete project management mode, approaching the end of our relationship with the same systematic efficiency I used for complex engineering problems that required immediate resolution. By the time I pulled into our building's parking garage, I'd already mentally cataloged everything that needed to happen and established a timeline for executing each step without emotional interference or second-guessing. I took the elevator up to the 15th floor and walked into our apartment with the focused determination of someone who'd finally accepted reality and was ready to act accordingly. The space that had felt like home for 4 years suddenly looked different to me, and I could see clearly which items belonged to me, which belonged to Melody, and which represented shared investments that would need to be divided or discarded. I started in the bedroom, methodically packing her entire wardrobe into the suitcases and designer luggage that I'd bought for vacations we'd taken together. Every piece of clothing went into labeled containers, work outfits in one suitcase, casual wear in another, shoes and accessories in shopping bags from the stores where I'd watched her spend money we couldn't afford. The designer dress she'd worn tonight, the one I'd bought for our anniversary, went into a separate bag along with the jewelry and handbags that represented thousands of dollars of my income invested in someone who'd used them to attract other men. I moved through the apartment like an engineer decommissioning a failed system, photographing each step of the process to document exactly what belonged to whom and ensure there could be no disputes later about missing items or property damage. Her toiletries, makeup and beauty products filled 2 large boxes, and I was amazed at how much space her possessions actually occupied when gathered together systematically. The living room yielded books, magazines, decorative items, and electronics that she'd brought into our shared space, all of it packed efficiently and labeled clearly for easy identification. I changed the access codes for the building's main entrance, the parking garage, and our individual apartment unit, ensuring that her key cards would no longer provide entry to any part of the property. The lease was solely in my name due to her poor credit score from previous financial mistakes, which gave me complete legal authority to remove an unlisted occupant who hadn't contributed to rent payments in over 3 months. I'd been covering her share without complaint because I thought we were building something together, but tonight had clarified that she'd been treating our arrangement as a temporary convenience rather than a partnership. The research I'd done months ago about tenancy laws in Arizona confirmed that someone who wasn't on the lease and wasn't paying rent had no legal claim to continued occupancy, especially when the primary tenant requested their removal. I arranged her packed belongings in the building's storage area on the ground floor, organizing everything neatly and taking final photos to document the condition and completeness of her possessions. The entire process took exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes, and when I finished, the apartment felt cleaner and more spacious than it had in months. My phone had been buzzing constantly throughout the packing process with calls and texts from Melody, but I waited until everything was completely finished before checking her messages. The progression from anger to panic to desperation was clearly visible in her communications, starting with accusations that I was overreacting and escalating to pleas for me to come back and pick her up from the wine bar. Her final message revealed exactly what she thought our relationship had been about. She expected me to provide transportation, housing, and financial support regardless of how she chose to treat me or our relationship boundaries. When she called again around 1:30 in the morning, I answered with the same calm professionalism I'd used to inform a client about project termination. I explained that her belongings were packed and waiting in the building's storage area, accessible through the main entrance but no longer through our apartment unit. I informed her that she'd never been added to the lease due to her credit issues, and her failure to contribute to rent for 3 consecutive months gave me legal grounds for immediate removal of an unlisted occupant. The conversation shifted dramatically as she realized I wasn't playing some temporary emotional game but had actually moved forward with permanent consequences for her choices. Her voice changed from demanding to pleading as she understood that I'd completely detached from whatever manipulation tactics she'd planned to use for damage control. I explained calmly that Brett could provide whatever transportation and housing support she needed going forward, since she'd made it clear that he was her priority and I was just an obstacle to their relationship development. When she started crying and claiming that nothing had actually happened between them, I pointed out that her public defense of his behavior and dismissal of my concerns had revealed everything I needed to know about her real feelings and intentions. I told her that successful relationships required mutual respect and shared boundaries, and she demonstrated tonight that she wasn't interested in either of those foundational elements. The call ended when I explained that all future communication should go through Brett since he was clearly the person she'd chosen to prioritize, and I blocked her number immediately after hanging up. The months following Melody's removal from my life brought transformations that I hadn't anticipated, starting with immediate improvements to my financial situation and extending into personal and professional growth that had been impossible while managing the constant drama and expense of her lifestyle demands. Without her monthly costs draining my resources, I suddenly had an extra $4,000 available for investments, savings, and personal development that actually benefited my long-term goals rather than funding someone else's social media image. The promotion to senior aerospace engineer came through 6 weeks after the breakup, partly due to my improved focus and performance once I wasn't spending mental energy on relationship problems, and partly because I could finally accept the additional responsibilities that came with advanced positions. My supervisor mentioned that my work quality had noticeably improved and that I seemed more confident during client presentations and technical meetings, though I didn't explain the personal circumstances that had led to my professional renaissance. I used the salary increase and newfound financial freedom to purchase the luxury car I'd been wanting for years, a BMW sedan with advanced engineering features that appealed to both my practical needs and appreciation for well-designed systems. The membership at Phoenix's most exclusive fitness club came next, giving me access to state-of-the-art equipment, professional trainers, and a social environment filled with successful people who shared similar values about discipline and personal improvement. The physical transformation followed naturally from having time and energy to focus on my health rather than constantly managing someone else's emotional demands and financial crises. I renovated the entire apartment during this period, removing all traces of Melody's influence and creating a space that reflected my own preferences and professional success. The new furniture, upgraded electronics, and modern design elements transformed our former shared space into something that felt genuinely like home rather than a compromise between conflicting tastes and priorities. The improvement in my mental health was dramatic and immediate, and I realized how much stress and anxiety had been generated by trying to maintain a relationship with someone who fundamentally didn't respect me or share my values. Meanwhile, Melody's social media presence provided an unintentional documentary of her deteriorating situation as reality set in and her fantasy lifestyle proved unsustainable without my financial support. Her Instagram posts shifted from confident lifestyle content to increasingly desperate attempts to maintain her image while dealing with obvious practical problems. The designer outfits appeared less frequently, replaced by cheaper alternatives and repeated clothing choices that suggested serious budget constraints. Her captions became more defensive and bitter, filled with inspirational quotes about knowing your worth and not settling for less, which seemed ironic given her current circumstances compared to the stable life she'd abandoned. Through mutual acquaintances in Phoenix's professional community, I learned details about her downward spiral that confirmed my decision to cut all contact rather than allowing her back into my life through guilt or manipulation. Brett's interest had predictably waned once the conquest was complete and the novelty of stealing someone else's girlfriend wore off, leaving Melody without the validation she'd sacrificed everything to obtain. Her performance at the marketing firm deteriorated rapidly as personal drama interfered with her work quality, and the party-focused culture that had initially attracted her proved to be professionally toxic when client relationships suffered due to unprofessional behavior. The alcohol consumption that had seemed fun and social during team celebrations became problematic when it started affecting her judgment during business meetings and networking events. Her termination from the marketing consulting firm came after a series of incidents involving inappropriate behavior with clients and failure to meet basic professional standards, leaving her with employment gaps that made finding comparable positions increasingly difficult. Brett had already moved on to pursuing other female colleagues, treating Melody's dismissal as an unfortunate but inevitable consequence of mixing business with pleasure. The expensive lifestyle she'd maintained through my support became impossible on unemployment benefits, forcing her to move between temporary living situations with friends and family members who grew tired of supporting her financial irresponsibility. Her attempts to reach me through mutual friends, professional networking sites, and social media platforms were consistently blocked as I maintained complete no-contact protocol to prevent any possibility of manipulation or emotional interference with my improved life circumstances. The contrast between her declining situation and my flourishing independence validated every decision I'd made about ending our relationship and refusing to enable her destructive choices. Her desperate attempts to reconnect weren't motivated by genuine remorse or desire to rebuild our relationship, but by panic over losing her financial safety net and discovering that her new lifestyle choices had serious long-term consequences that couldn't be easily reversed or escaped through charm and manipulation. 8 months after that evening at the wine bar, I was leaving my office building after a particularly productive day when I noticed someone standing near the visitor parking area who looked familiar but out of place in the corporate environment. My aerospace firm occupied 3 floors of a prestigious downtown Phoenix complex, and the professional atmosphere typically attracted only business associates, clients, and employees rather than desperate individuals seeking personal confrontations. As I walked toward my BMW, I realized the disheveled woman waiting by the entrance was Melody, though she looked dramatically different from the confident person who'd once shared my life and commanded attention wherever she went. She'd clearly been tracking my schedule through professional networking sites or mutual connections, demonstrating the kind of stalking behavior that suggested she'd exhausted all other options for making contact despite my consistent blocking of her communication attempts. Her appearance shocked me more than her presence did, revealing the physical toll that 8 months of financial stress and lifestyle deterioration had taken on someone who'd once prided herself on maintaining an expensive image. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by discount store outfits that hung awkwardly on her diminished frame, and her once perfect hair and makeup showed the kind of neglect that comes from genuine desperation rather than calculated casualness. She looked smaller and more fragile than I remembered, with the hollow-eyed appearance of someone who'd been dealing with serious problems without adequate support systems or resources. When she spotted me approaching my car, her face cycled through relief, hope, and panic as she realized this might be her only opportunity to make whatever pitch she'd prepared for this ambush. She moved quickly to intercept me before I could reach my vehicle and escape, clearly having planned this encounter to maximize her chances of forcing a conversation I had no interest in having. Her opening words revealed exactly how desperate her situation had become and how completely she'd misunderstood the permanence of my decision to remove her from my life. She claimed she'd learned from her mistakes and wanted to rebuild our relationship on mature foundations, using language that sounded rehearsed and calculated rather than genuinely reflective or remorseful. The desperation in her voice was unmistakable as she explained her current circumstances, including potential bankruptcy, failed relationships, and employment disasters that had left her with nowhere else to turn for the stability she'd once taken for granted. Meanwhile, my own transformation was immediately visible and undoubtedly painful for her to witness, from my improved physique and confident demeanor to the expensive suit and luxury vehicle that demonstrated how well my life was progressing without her interference. I listened to her pitch with complete emotional detachment, analyzing her arguments with the same systematic approach I used for evaluating failed engineering projects that clients sometimes tried to revive despite fundamental design flaws. When she finished her prepared speech about wanting another chance, I delivered a comprehensive explanation of why reconciliation was impossible, treating our relationship like a canceled aerospace project that had required termination to prevent further resource waste. I explained that she represented operational inefficiency in my optimized life, someone who consumed resources without contributing meaningful value and who had demonstrated through her choices that she lacked the basic integrity required for successful partnerships. Her transformation from pleading to anger was predictable as she realized that I wouldn't be manipulated back into enabling her lifestyle or providing the financial rescue she'd clearly expected from this confrontation. She escalated to threats and insults, revealing the entitled mentality that had originally caused our relationship to fail and confirming that she'd learned nothing from the consequences of her previous choices. When she started screaming about how I'd changed and become cold, I calmly pointed out that I hadn't changed at all. I'd simply stopped accepting unacceptable behavior and started prioritizing my own well-being over her comfort and convenience. Her final desperate attempts to guilt me into resuming financial support fell flat because I could see clearly that her remorse was entirely situational, motivated by practical concerns rather than genuine understanding of how her actions had affected me or our relationship. I walked to my BMW without responding to her increasingly hysterical demands, started the engine, and drove away while she continued screaming in the corporate parking lot, creating exactly the kind of scene that would ensure building security escorted her off the property permanently. As I headed to a dinner meeting with potential business partners who represented the kind of professional opportunities that were now possible without relationship drama consuming my time and energy, I felt nothing but satisfaction with my decision to maintain boundaries and refuse to enable someone who had never learned to accept responsibility for her own choices. The woman screaming behind me was a stranger who'd burned every bridge that might have led back to the life she'd abandoned, and I had no obligation to rescue her from the consequences of prioritizing excitement over stability and validation over genuine love.